They laughed at it first because it looked like theater. A river of American trucks, nose to tail, pushing through French dust with improvised signs and painted circles, as if war could be solved with traffic rules. In German staff rooms, the phrase "red ball" sounded childish, an enemy trying to decorate desperation. Officers who had lived on rail timetables and depot ledgers looked at those convoys and saw waste, rubber tires wearing out, engines burning precious fuel, drivers exposed to ambush, an entire army gambling on roads. But the laughter did not last long, because the roads did not stop. Day after day, the same pattern returned. Allied spearheads kept moving, not because they were brave, but because they were fed. Ammunition arrived when it should have been delayed. Spare parts appeared before breakdowns became disasters. Whole formations that should have paused simply didn't. The Americans were not replacing the rail system. They were building a temporary artery with trucks. And they were doing it fast enough to make Germany's old logic feel slow. In the autumn of 1944, a German logistics officer could read the front by the sound of engines. Not German engines, American engines. The low growl that never quite went away. In villages behind the line, you could see the proof in small, humiliating details. Empty Allied fuel cans stacked like bricks, fresh tires on vehicles that should have been worn bald, artillery batteries that kept firing without the quiet gaps that used to mean shortage. A war machine is not only steel and courage, it is flow. And the Red Ball Express was flow made visible. Thousands of trucks turning gasoline into momentum. German officers did what professionals do when the enemy shows competence. They stopped joking and started calculating. They wrote reports that sounded cold but carried a private fear. If the enemy can feed a breakout without rails, the enemy can keep breaking out. If the enemy can repair faster than you can disrupt, your best defensive lines become temporary. If the enemy can move every day, your time disappears. That is why the winter plan was framed as more than a battle. It was framed as a correction. A breakthrough in the West, driven hard, might split Allied forces, seize key crossings, and force negotiation. The staff language was clean. The ambition behind it was desperate. Germany did not need a perfect victory. It needed time, and time was purchased by disrupting the enemy's pace. And there was a seductive thought inside the plan. The Allies were dependent on trucks. If you punch the road network, take the junctions, take the bridges, you strangle the flow. If you do that, their speed dies the way yours has died so many times. Quietly, invisibly, with men waiting on empty cans. But the plan had its own hidden condition, and every serious officer could see it if he looked long enough. Fuel. A panzer division is not a weapon. It is a promise that must be paid for every kilometer. Tanks drink, half-tracks drink, trucks drink, staff cars drink. Even success drinks faster because success moves faster. In briefings, officers spoke about distance and surprise like they were pure tactics. In the margins, logistics officers underlined the same words again and again: consumption, reserves, capture. The breakthrough was designed to run on fuel it did not truly possess. It depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps, seizing enemy stocks, and keeping the column moving so quickly that the lack of supply could be replaced by loot. It was not a plan built on abundance. It was a plan built on theft. Some men believed theft could work because they had seen it work before in smaller ways. Captured trucks used for transport, Enemy fuel poured into German jerry cans. Local stocks seized from depots. But that was opportunism. This was a doctrine, an offensive engineered to survive on enemy fuel. In a warm room with a map, this looked like cleverness. On a winter road, it would look like roulette. And still, the order came. The machines were gathered. Crews checked engines in dim light, breath turning to fog. Mechanics tightened track pins with numb hands. Drivers warmed blocks and cursed batteries that hated the cold. The men who would ride at the front spoke about speed, about pushing through the first resistance, about not stopping. They all knew the rule that wasn't written on any map. The first days decide everything. If you slow down, the enemy organizes. If the enemy organizes, you are no longer breaking through. You are grinding. And Germany could not afford grinding. So the first thrust was violent and hopeful. Roads filled with German movement, columns pressing forward, artillery shifting, infantry riding where they could. In the fog and snow, the advance had a strange beauty, the kind that tempts a man into believing the plan is working simply because the machines are moving. Reports began to sound confident. A junction taken, a bridge approached, an enemy unit surprised, a road opened, and then the staff began receiving a different kind of report, not from the front line, from the spaces between. Fuel trucks delayed, fuel points missed, a refuel scheduled that did not happen, a detour taken that added kilometers and burned reserves, a tank left behind not because it was destroyed, but because it was dry, a column stopping in the open, engines off, as if the war had abruptly run out of electricity. At first, the answers were simple. The roads were crowded, the routes were damaged, enemy air threatened movement, the weather slowed everything. There were still ways to patch the system, push a different route, take fuel from rear echelons, prioritize the spearhead, but then the pattern spread. More units reported the same condition. The offensive was moving faster than its fuel could chase it. This is the kind of failure that looks small until it becomes fatal. A tank without fuel is not a tank. It is cover. It is a block in the road. It is a signal to the enemy that your momentum has become fragile. A panzer unit that pauses for fuel does not simply lose time. It loses the psychological advantage that makes a breakthrough possible. Once you stop, the enemy stops being surprised. The enemy starts hunting, and the cruel irony settled over the German staff like frost. They had studied the Red Ball Express as a weakness, an enemy dependent on trucks. But the Americans had built a truck system precisely to prevent this moment. They had learned that modern war is not won by the sharpness of the first blow alone. It is won by the ability to keep moving after the first blow. And now Germany's breakthrough, the one designed to cut Allied flow, was discovering the oldest law of mechanics. Nothing moves without fuel. In the next segment, the story tightens around the spearheads themselves, the desperate search for captured gasoline, the gamble of pushing farther on fumes, and the moment German commanders realized that bridges and time were not the only gatekeepers. Fuel was. The spearhead learned the truth first, because the spearhead is always the first to go hungry. At the front of the German push, officers could still talk about surprise, about momentum, about the enemy being slow to react. But the men closest to the tanks could read the war by smaller signs. An engine that stayed off longer than it should, a half-track that rolled to the shoulder and didn't come back. A driver walking with a can in his hand, not toward battle, but toward rumors. In the original imagination of the plan, fuel was a problem to be solved by speed, Move fast enough, and the gap between consumption and supply would be filled by captured depots. Get through the first resistance, seize the junctions, and gasoline would appear the way it always appears in optimistic staff work, right on time. But in real villages and real forests, gasoline does not wait politely. It hides in wrong places, behind locked doors, in barrels that are not where the maps say they are, in truck parks that have already been moved, in dumps that are empty because the enemy burned them before retreating. It hides in the chaos of war itself. The first captured supplies were smaller than the fantasies. A few drums, a handful of jerry cans, a scattered yard of fuel that felt like salvation to one platoon and like a joke to a division. Crews siphoned whatever they could. They carried cans like treasure. They poured muddy fuel through cloth filters and prayed their engines would forgive them. And then the arithmetic began to turn ugly. A tank might take a share and move a few more kilometers, but the kilometers cost more than the share could repay. A column that detoured to find fuel used fuel searching for fuel. A unit that stopped to refuel became vulnerable, and vulnerability forced security measures that slowed movement, and slow movement demanded more fuel to keep engines idling in cold air. This is the kind of loop that destroys an offensive without a single dramatic explosion. Men still fought, guns still fired, tanks still killed, but the underlying motion, the pulse that turns battle into breakthrough, began to weaken. Then came the bridge problem. German commanders knew bridges were the gates of any westward push. Rivers and canals were not just lines on a map, they were obstacles that demanded engineers, time, and intact crossings. And intact crossings were rare because the enemy understood the same truth. If you cannot stop a column with steel, stop it with geography. Blow the bridges and make speed pay rent in hours. At first, German units found openings, a bridge still standing, a crossing seized before it could be destroyed, a surprised guard, a broken enemy demolition charge. Each intact bridge felt like fate smiling, but even intact bridges demanded something the offensive could not easily afford: order. Tanks cannot cross like cars. A heavy vehicle wants spacing, it wants control, it wants engineers checking weight and structure, it wants traffic discipline to prevent jams. In war, traffic discipline is a luxury, and in a fuel-starved offensive, it becomes a cruel joke, because every minute in a jam is fuel burning for nothing. So the roads began to clog. A stalled truck in a narrow lane could trap an entire armored column behind it. A tank that ran dry in the wrong place became a wall. Half-tracks and staff cars stacked behind, engines idling, exhaust forming a low fog. Men climbed down and stared ahead as if staring could fix the physics. All of this happened under the shadow that German planners feared most: Allied air power. Not always bombs, sometimes just presence. On clear stretches, fighters appeared like predators. The German columns learned to freeze when they heard engines overhead, to hide under trees, to stop moving because movement meant visibility. Every pause protected the column from the sky, but every pause increased the hunger on the ground. A war machine being hunted from above becomes cautious. A cautious war machine becomes slow. A slow war machine becomes thirsty. German commanders reacted with the tools they had. They triaged. They prioritized the spearhead at the expense of the body. Fuel meant for rear units was stolen forward. Staff cars were abandoned. Trucks were cannibalized. Some vehicles were refueled while others were left dry. Their crews pulled off to ride with somebody else. The offensive became a creature shedding weight just to keep its teeth. And yet the distances did not shrink. Each town captured added new kilometers to the tale. Each turn off a main road, taken to avoid traffic or to bypass resistance, added more kilometers, more time, more consumption. The supply lines were not lines anymore. They were tangled cords stretched across winter terrain, vulnerable to every accident, every ambush, every broken bridge. There were moments when it almost worked anyway. A fuel dump found intact, enough to make men smile like they had been given life back. Engines starting up across a column like a chain reaction. The sudden feeling of motion returning. The brief illusion that the plan's arrogance had been justified. Then the fuel would vanish again. Because the offensive was not failing for one reason. It was failing for the reason the Red Ball Express existed. Modern warfare is not simply about having fuel. It is about having a system that moves fuel forward at the rate your machines consume it. The Americans had built that system with rules, routing, repair depots, MPS, maintenance discipline, and sheer industrial volume. Their truck network was not a desperate trick. It was an engineered response to distance. It was an admission that the battlefield had grown too large for rail alone, and a decision to solve it with organization. Germany's breakthrough depended on the opposite idea. That fuel could be acquired by momentum, that speed could replace logistics, that capture could replace supply. Speed can steal a lot, but speed cannot steal from empty ground. As the days passed, German radio traffic began to shift tone. The words became sharper, requests for fuel repeated, arguments between units grew bitter, accusations flew. Someone took fuel that wasn't theirs. Someone promised a refuel that never arrived. Someone blocked a road. Someone moved too slowly. In a breakthrough, morale is built on motion. When motion dies, men start blaming each other. And the Allies were no longer confused. They were awake. Behind the front, American staff officers did not need poetry to understand what was happening. They watched the same signs Germany once watched. Abandoned vehicles, stalled columns, a capture that did not turn into a continuation. They recognized the sound of an offensive that had run ahead of its stomach. They did not need to win a dramatic battle everywhere. They needed to hold the roads, protect the crossings, and let the enemy's fuel problem do the work. Because the most humiliating defeat is not being driven back by fire, it is being stopped by emptiness. In the next segment, the story narrows to the moment German commanders tried to solve the problem the only way left. By gambling everything on captured fuel, by pushing spearheads beyond safe limits, and by discovering that the Red Ball Express was not just trucks. It was time, delivered in barrels. By the time the German commanders admitted the truth, they were already living inside it. The breakthrough was no longer a clean arrow on a map. It was a series of hungry thrusts, each one trying to bite far enough forward to find fuel before the teeth went numb. The officers at the front stopped asking whether the plan was working in the abstract. They asked simpler questions that sound small until you realize they decide the fate of armies. How many kilometers are left in the tanks? How long can we idle before the engines must be shut down? Which road can we take that avoids traffic, avoids aircraft, and still leads to something worth capturing? In a staff room, a fuel dump is a symbol. On a winter road, it is a rumor. So the offensive began to chase rumors. A report came in that a depot had been found. A column turned toward it, burning what little remained to reach it first. Another unit heard the same report and did the same. Hours later, the rumor became a scene. German soldiers standing around a yard of empty barrels, or worse, barrels filled with water and sludge, the enemy's final insult left behind. This is the kind of humiliation that does not need propaganda. It happens in silence. In the moment a driver realizes the prize he chased is gone. Still, there were real captures, real gasoline, real moments when German tanks drank and the offensive felt alive again. Those moments were sharp, intoxicating, and dangerous because they made the commanders believe the system could keep feeding itself if they pushed harder. So they pushed. Spearheads were ordered to take risks they would never take in a well-supplied army. They bypassed resistance where they could. They ignored flanks. They accepted the idea that the rear would catch up later, even though the rear was already tangled, already delayed, already starving. The offensive became a thin, stretched rope, pulled forward by hope and held back by reality. And then the road itself began to fight. The Ardennes roads were narrow in the best of times. In winter, they became corridors of mud and ice, bordered by ditches and trees that punished mistakes. A truck that slid sideways could block an entire division's movement. A tank that ran dry in the wrong bend could freeze the whole column behind it. The German army had once been famous for movement. Now movement was a fragile thing that could be broken by one stalled engine. The Americans noticed, and they adjusted their own behavior the way an experienced opponent does when he senses weakness. They did not treat the German thrust as a single monster that must be slain by one heroic strike. They treated it like a machine that would be starved. They used air power when weather allowed, not necessarily to destroy every tank, but to force halts. They used artillery and roadblocks to create traffic. They defended junctions with a cold understanding that a junction is not only terrain, it is logistics. Every minute of delay at a junction is fuel that never returns. The German commanders tried to solve the junction problem with speed and intimidation, but speed required fuel, and intimidation does not move an engine. As the offensive slowed, it began to reveal its deepest weakness. It depended on time more than the Allies did. Germany needed the breakthrough quickly because Germany could not sustain a long offensive. The Allies, even when surprised, could absorb a shock and rebuild a line because their system was designed to keep feeding itself. This was the invisible duel behind the visible battle, not just Germans versus Americans, but systems versus systems. The Red Ball Express was not simply a convoy of trucks. It was a doctrine of continuity. Keep the front fed, keep the front moving, keep the front stable even when the plan changes. It was the admission that friction is constant and the decision to build resilience. German planning for the breakthrough was the opposite. It assumed a short, decisive stroke. It assumed the enemy would be stunned long enough for capture to substitute for supply. It assumed winter would protect movement from air and give the column freedom. Winter did protect sometimes, but winter also demanded more fuel. Cold thickened oils, resisted engines, slowed movement. Vehicles needed longer warm-ups. Drivers kept engines running to prevent freezing. Every cold hour was a tax on the fuel balance. Even the weather that helped hide the column from aircraft punished it on the ground, and the punishment accumulated. By now, German officers were doing something that looks absurd to a man who has never seen an army run on the edge of emptiness. They were negotiating fuel, not requesting it, negotiating. One unit promised another a share if the road was cleared. A commander bargained with a rear echelon for cans meant for trucks. A staff officer wrote priority lists that felt like ration cards. Fuel became politics, and politics became friction, and friction became delay, and delay became failure. Some crews did the only thing they could do in a war that punishes hesitation. They abandoned machines, not because the machines were destroyed, because the machines were dry. A panther left beside a hedgerow with no fire scars looks like a mystery to a casual observer. To a soldier, it is a confession. It says, "We could not feed our own power." It says, "The engine was stronger than our system." This is the point where the offensive stops being a story of boldness and starts being a story of attrition against one's own limits. And at the same time, the irony sharpened into something almost cruelly elegant. Germany had believed the Red Ball Express was a weakness because it was visible, because it was trucks, obvious and vulnerable, a line that could be cut. But visibility can be strength when what is visible is supported by depth. Repair depots, replacement drivers, spare tires, routing discipline, fuel stocks, and a nation that can manufacture what it burns. Germany's fuel system was not visible because it was not there in the same way. It was improvised, fragmented, hunted, and shrinking. The commanders at the front could still order attacks, still take towns, still inflict losses, but the question of the offensive had already moved away from tactics. It had become a question of supply mathematics, and mathematics is indifferent to courage. When a breakthrough runs out of fuel, it does not end with a single dramatic moment. It ends with a slow loss of initiative, a hardening of enemy resistance, and the sudden realization that the window has closed. In the final segment, the story resolves the duel. How American logistics and road discipline outlasted the German gamble. How the fuel capture plan collapsed into stalled columns and abandoned armor. And why the Red Ball Express became the quiet weapon that decided the tempo of the entire campaign. In the end, the German breakthrough did not collapse like a building hit by a single bomb. It collapsed like a fire that runs out of air. The spearheads were still sharp enough to cut in places. German crews still fought with the discipline that comes from long habit. A panther could still dominate a road. A gun line could still punish any unit that exposed itself. But the offensive had lost the one thing that turns strength into victory: continuity. A breakthrough is not a moment, it is a process. It is the ability to keep pushing after the first success, to keep feeding the front when the enemy begins to recover, to keep time on your side when every hour makes resistance stronger. Germany's plan had been built on the idea that time could be stolen. Stolen by surprise, stolen by speed, stolen by capturing fuel and forcing the Allies into shock. For a few days it looked like theft might work. Then the window closed. Every day the roads became more crowded with stalled vehicles. Every night the calculations grew harder. How much fuel is left at the front? How much is trapped in the tail? How much will be spent tomorrow just to unjam the roads and warm the engines? How much can be spared for a detour to search for a depot that might already be empty? And behind those calculations sat the unforgiving truth. Even a successful capture did not fix the system. A captured dump could refill a handful of units, but it could not create a pipeline. It could not guarantee tomorrow's movement, or the next day's, or the day after that. Meanwhile, the Allies did what resilient systems do. They adjusted. They rerouted convoys around threatened roads. They protected key junctions with layered units. They built temporary traffic discipline where chaos would have killed momentum. They repaired what broke, not perfectly, but quickly. They kept fuel moving forward even when the front line shifted, because the philosophy underneath their logistics was not one decisive push. It was keep the machine fed. This is the part many soldiers only understand after watching an army lose. The enemy does not need to destroy your tanks if he can stop your tanks. The enemy does not need to win every firefight if he can win the schedule. As German columns stalled, American commanders began choosing their targets with a logistical mind. They struck junctions, bridges, and choke points that forced vehicles to bunch. They used artillery to turn narrow roads into slow roads. They used air power when it appeared, not only to kill, but to pressure. Pressure created pauses. Pauses created jams. Jams burned fuel. Fuel loss created more pauses. The German offensive was not simply being fought, it was being managed into failure. Then came the moment when German commanders faced the final strategic humiliation of their gamble. They had built a plan that required fuel they did not possess, and the fuel they hoped to seize was increasingly unreachable. Not because the Allies had infinite fuel, but because the Allies protected the flow with discipline. That is what the Red Ball Express represented at its best. Not just trucks, but a culture of prioritizing movement, a culture of saying, the front cannot stop, and then designing procedures to make cannot stop possible. The German commanders had mocked the convoy idea because it looked improvised. But improvisation becomes doctrine when it works, and doctrine becomes power when it is repeated. By now, Germany could still inflict tactical pain, but it could not sustain operational speed. And without speed, the breakthrough was just another fight, and Germany could not afford just another fight. The offensive began to settle into its inevitable shape. Strong points rather than sweeping arcs. Local advances rather than continuous thrusts, defensive reactions rather than offensive initiative. The map that once showed a bold penetration began to look like a bruise, dark and irregular, spreading in places but no longer moving forward with purpose. In the villages and forests, the war left its quiet evidence. Abandoned armor that still looked intact, parked like museum pieces in the wrong places. Fuel cans scattered like broken promises. Wreckers and recovery crews trying to pull the heavy machines away before the enemy could claim them, often failing because the same fuel shortage that stopped tanks also stopped the equipment meant to retrieve them. Men sleeping beside engines to keep them from freezing, then waking to find that the engine was still frozen, because the fuel to run it safely was not there. These are not the scenes of a dramatic defeat. They are the scenes of a system that has hit its limit. And when a system hits its limit, it does not matter how skilled the crews are. It does not matter how brave the front line is. It does not matter how perfect the tank looks in the brochure. Bridges, fuel, and time do not negotiate. They do not care what you hoped. They care only what you can sustain. That is why the irony of the Red Ball Express matters. German officers once dismissed it because it looked like a temporary trick. But the trick was not the trucks. The trick was that the Americans built a repeatable method of turning fuel into movement across distance. They made logistics feel ordinary, and when logistics becomes ordinary, the enemy stops being able to shock you by cutting one line. Germany tried to win by creating shock. America absorbed shock with flow. And in war, flow is often stronger than shock, because shock fades and flow continues. So the breakthrough ended not as a triumphant march, but as a stalled argument between machines and empty cans. The offensive had gambled that it could live off capture. The enemy had gambled that discipline would outlast desperation. Discipline won. If there is a lesson here, It is not that trucks are glamorous or that logistics is romantic. It is that modern war is decided by what looks boring until it fails. Fuel, roads, repairs, routing, and time. A tank can win a fight, but only a system can win a campaign. Thank you for watching. If you want more WWII logistics, engineering, and weapon stories told in this cinematic style, subscribe for the next full episode. The subscribe link is in the description.